It's the 21st century. The Chinese are coming. Technology is inexorable. Globalization, communications is getting small. We work with people all over the planet. The competition is keen. If you're unfit, if you don't have something to offer, if you're not productive, if you don't have a skill, if you haven't mastered anything, you're going to be left behind. I'm fearful that a third of the African-American descended from slaves population languishing are going to be left behind. They're going to no longer be able to command the attention, their issues and their problems and concerns in a concerted way with real heft behind it of their fellow citizens. They're going to be seen as impediments to the Make America Great Again project, and they're going to be locked up. They're going to be shunted. They're going to be dealt with, contained. They're not going to be elevated. They're not going to be developed. They're not going to be the objects of a kind of concerted public effort at amelioration. Maybe that's what should happen. That, by the way, doesn't preclude a concern within American politics for people who are struggling. It just announces a turn, a historic turn, away from a special concern about Black people who are struggling. Hey, John, how you doing, man?
Hey, Glenn, how are you?
I'm all right. This is Glenn Loury. This is The Glenn Show. I'm with John McWhorter, my conversation partner. Every other week we talk. This is our week. John teaches at Columbia. I teach at Brown University. He writes for the New York Times, and I am John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So, John, DEI is over, John.
Yeah.
What are we going to do, man? I mean, that was our bread and butter, wasn't it? The critique of the DEI excesses.
Yeah, I think the problem with the way it's being discussed is that people are playing a little game. I don't know if they're doing it deliberately, but DEI is a term that I don't think I knew until 2020. And what that executive order of Trump's is doing is eliminating the excesses that we've seen since the George Floyd era, partly. But the way it's being discussed by good people is as if what he's basically saying is that we should not try to work against racism at all, and that what he's trying to do is cancel the Civil Rights Act of 1964, et cetera. And I think that that's a sloppy way of looking at it. I'm fully on board with getting rid of the kind of DEI that is about dismissing whiteness and changing standards in order to have as few white people around as possible. That's what it's been for the past 5 years. And that's got to go, including the struggle sessions, all of the Robin DiAngelo stuff. The question is whether Trumpians need to go as far as, for example, canceling affirmative action. And that's where I think the controversy comes in. And that's where I'm not on board. It's a messy executive order. But the heart of it, which is canceling this nonsense from 2020 on, I'm very much on board with that. What do you think?
Well, what about Black History Month? You want to get rid of that?
No.
Because Pete Hegseth, my understanding reading the Washington Post this morning is that Pete Hegseth has issued a directive that DOD, Department of Defense personnel are not supposed to do their Black History Month thing that they usually do, which is, I assume, a series of events, speakers coming in, and various other acknowledgments of African-American historical experience, narrative, interest, and et cetera. And I assume that's partly for the benefit of the employees of color within the agency, but also meant to be an expression of the agency's awareness of, concerns about, acknowledgement of the issues affecting Blacks. No more Black History Month. You okay with that?
No, and I didn't know about that. But see, there's a fine line on things like that, because nominally what somebody like Hegseth is going after is the kind of history lesson that's designed to make white people feel guilty, and that makes it seem like all of American history has just been one long hit job. That is not what should be taught. But the idea that to have Black History Month is just, the way somebody like Hegseth often puts it, is you're stirring that stuff up. I find that blinkered and ignorant. So no, the idea is not that we're not going to pay attention to the history of Black America, including the racism and discrimination that's involved. Of course, I think both of us have our problems with the idea that that defines what Blackness is and that that must shape the way we evaluate Black people now. There's a line, but these are not subtle people, and so we have a problem.
Okay.
How
Well,
about fellowships?
how about what?
An organization offers some kind of fellowship designed for quote unquote minorities. I think that that's fine if an organization wants to do that. That's not stirring that stuff up. And that has nothing to do with Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi. What do you think?
Did you say fellowship?
Yeah, fellowship.
Like they create a position and they say this is a designated fellowship for African American or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Or even in graduate departments, that there's money set aside for minority students, for example.
I think that's in the crosshairs. I think that's a cousin to having lower standards. I think you could put the question differently. You could say, I have a position which is oriented toward the study of these issues, African American, but it's open to anybody who studies them effectively, regardless of what race they are. I think if you create a position or a graduate program creates a fellowship for students that is race exclusive, that crosses the anti-DEI line and is akin to affirmative action. So I don't have the same problem with that as I have with canceling Martin Luther King Day or Black History Month, because I want to draw a distinction between how people are treated. I have a job to offer. I offer it to the best qualified person, and I don't use a racial test. And how interests are defined. I have a program or a policy that is motivated in part by a reaction to racial inequality or a legacy of the history of racial discrimination or the concerns about the possibility of ongoing racial discrimination. The policy is motivated by an interpretation of history and a kind of broadly defined set of public goals. The treatment of individuals, I think, does raise questions about fairness, and white males who are excluded have a right to be concerned about. Does that make any sense to you? I'm trying to draw a distinction between blindness, so we're going to be colorblind when we deal with individuals, and indifference. So we're going to be unconcerned about racial matters as we go about our public business. Blindness, I think, is eminently defensible. I think is what I've been arguing for a long time. And I think it's consistent with the Supreme Court's 2023 affirmative action decision, as well as with the anti-DEI reaction against the excesses of race-obsessed public and college and so on administration, business organizations and whatnot. Blindness is one thing, but indifference is a completely different thing. It's saying, I see that this community, which is mostly Black and brown, is desperate, violent, underserved, in need of various things. And I don't feel motivated to do anything about it. I don't allow the racial aspect of the history and the ongoing circumstance to influence how it is that I want to think about my reaction to the needs of this community. I don't know. Maybe I'm splitting hairs here. Do you think so?
No, I don't. I know what you mean. I mean, there's a larger picture, which is the Supreme Court decision, and then this. There is clearly a movement against what I think both of us would think of as having become excess attention paid to these sorts of things, to the point that fairness was a legitimate question, despite the fact that there will always be people who can see nothing in 23 and this now, but racism on the march. There will always be those people, and they'll be overrepresented in media organs. But I think that's a rather blinkered view. We're having a national conversation, and we're trimming excesses and swinging a pendulum back into the middle. But yeah, the question is, what can still be done? Is everything a matter of stirring stuff up? Is everything a matter of unfairness to white people like Hegseth, et cetera? And there needs to be a conversation about that. I would hope that people who want to celebrate Black History Month, frankly, I think Black History Month is not a bad thing. It's super obsolete, superannuated. I was going to say it's obsolete. It's just that it's not 1970. It's not that we need to have a special month where we pay attention to Black history. We pay attention to Black history all year. And by we, I mean the United States. There's no reason for there to be a month. Even 10 years ago, I think it was, Morgan Freeman said, why does there have to be only 1 month? And the truth is, there isn't. The lesson has been learned. Black history is not under-attended to in the United States' thinking culture. And so, but it doesn't hurt anything. And I would hope that people would push back against that. There's no reason to get rid of Black History Month as some sort of scourge. And it makes an awful lot of people feel good. It reminds us of certain things. So it's just a matter of what needs to be gotten rid of. And I don't think you're splitting hairs, but what you're talking about is something that I think most of the people responsible for this would not be capable of quite wrapping their heads around. And that's what the problem is.
It's been an intense few weeks. So much news, so much spin from both the left and the right. Keeping up can feel overwhelming. That's why I turn to Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on every day to cut through the noise, see all sides, and get closer to the truth. Check it out for yourself at ground.news/Glenn Show. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. I find it very helpful for gaining a balanced perspective in our hyper-polarized world. To show you what I mean, here's a story that's ignored by left-leaning outlets. Denmark says open to expanding U.S. military role in Greenland. And here's one with almost no coverage on the right. Palestinians fear a repeat of their 1948 mass expulsion in the wake of Trump's remarks on Gaza. For both of these, and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you don't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
I don't know. Are you afraid? Does all this scare you?
I'm not afraid. In fact, it's kind of like chickens coming home to roost. You guys, that is the DEI mongers, overplayed your hand by a wide margin. You invited this backlash with your arrogance, with your contempt for the reasonable objections and sensibilities of your fellow citizens. You played your card. You had this race card, this Trump card in the back of your hand. I'm a victim, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, structural racism, systemic bias. You played on the gullibility and vulnerability and emotional fragility, white fragility of the white liberal governing elites. You infiltrated the Democratic Party and made this thing into a kind of one-size-fits-all accusation against American society. And it engendered a backlash, not just from white men, from normies, the kind of people who made Donald Trump president of the United States. It engendered a backlash, and now you're reaping what you have sown. You did sometimes flout standards in the interest of complexion, in the interest of composing the ideal demographically diverse class or cadres of employees or elites or whatever. And then on occasion, people who were unfit for the high level to which they had been elevated exposed themselves as such. And that did not go unnoticed. You did all of these things. And now Christopher Rufo, you reap what you sow. Mm-hmm. So no, I'm not afraid. But it does have my attention because okay. I am afraid. I'm afraid that the narrative is going to shift irrevocably and the country is going to move on. I've been warning about this for a long time. It's the 21st century. The Chinese are coming. Technology is inexorable. Globalization, communications is getting small. We work with people all over the planet. The competition is keen. If you're unfit, if you don't have something to offer, if you're not productive, if you don't have a skill, if you haven't mastered anything, you're going to be left behind. I'm fearful that a quarter, a third of the African American descended from slaves population languishing are going to be left behind. They're going to no longer be able to command the attention, their issues and their problems and concerns in a concerted way with real heft behind it of their fellow citizens. They're going to be seen as impediments to the Make America Great Again project, and they're going to be locked up. They're going to be shunted. They're going to be dealt with, contained. They're not going to be elevated. They're not going to be developed. They're not going to be the objects of a kind of concerted public effort at amelioration. And maybe that's what should happen. That's kind of the logic of some of the arguments that I've been making for years. That, by the way, doesn't preclude a concern within American politics for people who are struggling. It just announces a turn, a historic turn, away from a special concern about Black people who are struggling.
Glenn, well, first of all, yes, the DEI people overplayed their hand. And I hate to sound petty, but in the historical sense, we're going to look at 2020 and 2021, and we're going to see our intelligentsia swooning over what is truly, and I'm sorry, this is just fact, white fragility, which is literally one of the worst books ever written. It makes no sense. It's a very poor example of any kind of argumentation. It's a terrible book. And then also Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which frankly is a very mediocre book. It's not an excrescence the way white fragility is, but this is not sophisticated reasoning. And yet we were supposed to pretend to. And that's weird. I can't think of another time in recent American history when we were encouraged to live our lives according to a book or two that really just aren't worth that kind of attention. And then you get Christopher Rufo. And I should say something. And I'm sorry, Manhattan Institute, but his style is not something that I approve of, even when I'm interested in the things that he's finding. Still, last week on X, he slandered my friend Kathy Young. Kathy Young is a very intelligent writer for many sources and has been for about as long as I have been writing. She started out writing, tempering the excesses that she saw of feminism. And now she's just one of the smartest people around. She's striking a middle ground. She is a gentle, civilized person. Christopher Rufo got on X and called her physically ugly because of a piece that she wrote about Trump and DEI, where she questioned the excesses of that executive order. That is unforgivable. That is not proper behavior. So I just wanted to say, yes, he is an excess. Anyway, Glenn, it's funny. You're sounding like yourself 20 years ago, and I'm going to go to myself 20 years ago. What exactly would we want to see done for what used to be called the Black underclass? Because, it's at the point where the underclass is now white and Black. It's fentanyl and what's going on in the cities. And so the question is maybe how we address that. But if we're talking about Black uplift, if we're talking about Black gangbangers, et cetera, given what we've seen since the 60s, what would work? Just what has not happened? And there's a certain kind of person who's going to say more programs. That's not an answer, and that's not the answer that you would give. What is it that
Yeah,
you
I
were
mean,
afraid wouldn't happen?
I agree that another program is not the answer. And I'm not sure I have an answer to you about specifically what should public policy be that would address, quote, the Black underclass. You just address, quote, the underclass, and you would include everybody who was in that orbit, whether they were Black or not. The extent to which you might feel an urgency to address the underclass, quote unquote, the underclass is a controversial word, but let's go with it. The extent to which you might feel an urgency to do something about the facts of poverty, concentrated poverty, poor schools, whatever. And I mean, we could go down a policy list. You know, you could talk about doing something about the quality of education in these communities, or about occupational training and this kind of preparation of people for workforce or whatever. You could talk about that. You could talk about social services. You could talk about the family and what policies do or do not encourage people to marry or whatever. You could talk about
You can talk about it.
so there are all these, but you'd be talking about it for everybody, not specifically for Blacks. But the urgency to take up that conversation and the amount of effort that you might put into redressing these things might be enhanced by a recognition that there's a racial disproportion in what you do. I mean, you might feel that among the things you're accomplishing when you successfully intervene against poverty, poor education, joblessness, criminal victimization, and so on, among the things you're accomplishing is alleviating the burden or the weight of a legacy of racial unfairness and so on.
But
I know. I see you shaking your head. I'm not sure this flies. I may be in my 70s here, trying to hold on to a sensibility and a posture, an intellectual and political and philosophical posture that was well suited to the last quarter of the 20th century, but ill-suited to the second quarter of the 21st century, which is where we are. That may well be the case. And, times passes by and times change. The country is fast moving. There are many more Latino Hispanics than there are Blacks. As I say, the world is getting very, very small. The technological revolution that we're living through has implications that we can barely fathom. And maybe race, as Stanley Crouch once said to me, the late great Stanley Crouch, race is over, man. Didn't you know that race is over? Maybe race really is over.
It's beginning to be hard for me to see. And I've tried to write about what would help the Black community, such as, how drug laws are enforced and how people are taught to read and vocational training, as opposed to thinking everybody needs to study Shakespeare in college. But sometimes you wonder, you think about, we've discussed this when we had Randall Kennedy on a good while ago. Why is it that carjackings are mostly a Black thing? And somebody can maybe find some Vietnamese American kids doing it once, but Black thing. Why is it that the flash mobs that pop up, for example, in this city in New York, people getting together and just,
in Philadelphia, Chicago.
And all you have to do is look at the footage, and it's mostly Black kids. Yeah, there's the occasional somebody else, but it's a Black thing. And the mass robbings of stores, sometimes they're Bosnian or something, but it's a Black thing. I'm not sure what can be done about that. There's an extent to which, and here's the word that everybody hates so much, but a cultural thing settles in. A sense that this is what we do. People copycat each other. This is what we do. We got away with this. We can get away with this. And I don't know whether programs are going to help. And I'm not sure how much we can make it fly to say they're doing this because they don't have dads. And, how do you make more kids have dads? By telling people.
Excuse me for interrupting.
You have to talk about the family. You have to talk about the family. I've heard people saying that my whole life. And you can keep talking about it, but that doesn't make people get married. And so, it can be frustrating sometimes. I say in my 50s. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, I think there's a network, social media network phenomenon where you end up with a flash mob because John calls Joe, Joe calls Phil, Phil calls Sam, Sam calls Robert. They all say, let's meet downtown at the Esplanade and let's, whatever. And, and they've got their photos that they're posting on Instagram of, the shenanigans and, they're all reinforcing each other. And those networks, just like the violence networks, the people who are shooting at each other, they are largely a part of a structure of interlocking relationships, some of them adverse relationships. But, it's the random person is unlikely to get shot. It's the person who's embedded within this structure, who has beefs across the various lines and whatnot, who ends up being the victim or perpetrator of the violence. So if you draw a map, connecting the nodes of who's killing whom, it's very inbred and very dense. And, a person who's not in the network is unlikely either to be a part of the flash mob or to be part of the gang shooting that because he wore the wrong colors to school or whatever.
And
Something like that.
Seth doesn't call Benjamin, who calls Eli, who calls, I've run out of names, but guys with
Moses.
names like those guys don't call each other. Yeah, they call each other about other things. Seth doesn't call Eli to go downtown and raise hell. It's these people you're calling John and James, who today we know are named Daquan and Ray Ray. And they're the ones who are doing it. And it settles in. And yeah, that ends up being the way they think that's cool. And, the Great Society isn't going to help.
You're a culture guy. Popular music, hip hop. Gangster rap. Where's this come from? This glorification of, lionization of thuggery, of violence, of this kind of braggadocio. You even get professional athletes in their loose moments, allowing themselves to be photographed with pistols in their hands and stuff like that. Where the hell is that coming from?
And why is it that Seth and Eli enjoy that music too, including striking the poses here and there and dancing in a certain way, but it's play acting? Whereas with quote unquote John and Daquan, those two really go out and do it is the problem. It's one thing to live it, and it's another thing to just kind of play at it. And, these are old discussions, but sometimes you wonder what actually could be done about that, specifically, those specific behaviors. So the idea is just to fight poverty, although a lot of the people doing the things we're talking about are not poor. That's why some of this is culture rather than socioeconomics. But still, this stuff is very, very difficult.
Do you think that the withdrawal of the enthusiastic engagement of the public sectors, the federal government in the case at hand with the new Trump administration, but you can expect it to filter down. The red states will do different than the blue states will do. But the pulling away here, I think, is going to eventually become very widespread. That will occasion a more constructive response from advocates of the interests of Black people to turn their attention away from public policy fixes and toward the kinds of things that can be engendered within the communities themselves, the kind of things that the great Robert Woodson, the activist and organizer, promotes, of grassroots initiatives, of charter and private schooling stuff, of big brother and big sister, of church ministries that expand out into the community, like Corey Brooks, the pastor in Chicago who I've had on the show and who's a good guy, trying to help the kids in the little neighborhood that he ministers in. And you could get 1,000 points of light. A kind of internally generated renaissance of activism at the community level, big brother, big sister, et cetera. Adopting kids, just say no kind of cultural movements when Oprah decides she's going to use her enormous platform to try to persuade kids not to do drugs or to stay in school or to get married before they have babies or is that just a pipe dream on my part that there could be a silver lining in this cloud of moving away from conventional DEI thinking?
Glenn, I think you know the answer better than I do, which is maybe that's the best it can be. Because, I've been around long enough that I can see that there are always those 1,000 points of light people. Every city has got, in any quote unquote inner city community, there are some concerned women and men who are doing their best to tamp down the violence, etc., to give the kids something to do. There's always the talk of the community center. I would be interested to see if in a single city over the past 60 years, a community center has made any serious difference in the amount of violence in a community. But nevertheless, people keep opening community centers. And you need those people. Those are good people. They're doing the right thing. I tried to write about some of those people in my Manhattan Institute days, quarter century ago. Now, John Bryant, Operation Hope, what Star Parker was trying to do, what Omar Wassa was trying to do, they're always those people. And yet here we still are. Maybe that's the best it can be. And I'm not sure what has happened on the public level, on the governmental level, that's made significantly more of a difference in this hardcore of people who have a different sense of norms than the surrounding community does. The gangbanging, the carjacking, if that's a norm, what can anybody in a suit in Washington, D.C. or any state capital do? Maybe it's just a matter of these Band-Aids in each community to keep it from getting worse than it is. Maybe that's the best it can be. Is that too pessimistic?
That's an interesting thought.
There are always those people.
I'm wondering where the historically Black colleges and universities are going to fit into this renaissance that we're living through in the area of race policy in the government. Whereas the new Secretary of Defense may promulgate a ruling that wipes out the celebration of Black History Month, they're not going to change the didn't Trump change the endorsement of historically Black colleges and universities as legitimate institutions of development, not only for Black people, but largely for Black people, that are an inheritance of our racist past and that are doing many, maybe even most, good works, and that enjoy at both the state and the federal level special protection and support? Doesn't the philosophy, the Rufo-esque philosophy of let's get out of the bean counting business and let's not look at people based on their race, militate against a program of support for historically Black colleges and universities? Doesn't that draw out in explicit terms my concern about the distinction between blindness on the one hand and indifference? Turning the government's back on historically Black colleges and universities would be an effective declaration of indifference. You had your role, you served it historically. We don't need that kind of thing anymore. If you want to keep going as institutions, good luck to you. I wish you the best out there in the marketplace of competition for resources, but no, we're not going to put an umbrella over you. And we're not going to exempt you from the colorblind implications of our Constitution, which means we don't treat people or institutions differently based upon their racial identity.
Yeah, hopefully that will be treated as a third rail. And hopefully there'll be people, and I would certainly be one of them, arguing vigorously against that. Because, for example, and we touched on this in one of our recent conversations, there certainly has been a sense among Black youth since the late 60s that school is for white people. And it's something that happens when there are white people to define yourself against. Studies have been done that show that that's not a factor in an all-Black school. It's when you have white and Black kids together. That's what the studies show. And often the studies are touted as saying that there's no acting white phenomenon. No, there is. It's just that there have to be white kids around. And that means that the HBCUs are wonderful places where a Black person can exist, where there's a layer of nerds and grinds, and they're not seen as racially inauthentic because there are basically no white people around. I've seen it, and I sometimes wish I had experienced it. And given that the whole acting white thing happened as a kind of a series of accidents, it's not that all of a sudden Black kids didn't want to study. It wasn't a factor until roughly the late 60s. It was a response to how mean white people were when real desegregation of the schools happened. So it's not anybody's fault, but it settles in and it gets passed on and passed on. And I even asked after in one of our shows, is that still going on? And I asked for responses. I've gotten mixed responses. Some people say it's still going on. Some people say that died 20 years ago. So I don't know what to think. But the HBCUs are a great way of creating a Black intelligentsia and a Black identified intelligentsia. I think it would be really sad to see them lose that kind of support. And, you never know what Trump in particular is going to pull. But to really say, that's enough Morehouse, that's enough Howard, that would be radical beyond anything I can imagine. I lack imagination to conceive of that. And, he's only got 4 years, so we'll see.
John and I often talk about higher education on this podcast, obviously. That's the universe we both inhabit. And why not? It's a topic that has moved front and center of late at both the state and national level. Free speech on campus, viewpoint diversity on campus, cancel culture on campus, soaring tuition, affirmative action, race-based admissions, accreditation, the erosion of standards, attacks on the classics, hiring litmus tests, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You name it, it's in the news. So, with all that's going on, and there's a lot going on, to whom can one turn as a trusted resource of all issues related to campus reform, whether you're a student, faculty, trustee, administrator, donor, policymaker, or alumni? One source we want you to know about and strongly recommend as a credible and respected voice on all these issues is the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA, whom we're pleased to have supporting this episode. ACTA is on the front lines, promoting academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability at America's colleges and universities. They don't just serve as trusted advisors to college trustees and alumni, they help arm reformers with resources, ideas, recommendations, information, even grassroots alumni support through their Campus Freedom Initiative. They make positive changes happen, and they approach these issues in a nonpartisan, balanced, informed, highly credible way, which we appreciate. If you care deeply about these issues, as John and I do, you really must know more about the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Start by looking them up on the web at goacta.org. That's goacta.org. And follow them on Twitter and Facebook. I hear that our nemesis, Ibram X. Kendi, is moving from Boston University to Howard University with his institute, and will be setting up shop there effective, I gather, the fall of 2025. What do you make of that?
Well, the institute at BU, Boston University, failed. It didn't produce anything over years' time. It had nothing to do with corruption. He didn't steal any money, but funding dried up. But when there was lots of funding, nothing happened to it. That's not his skill set. And I can definitely say it would not be mine. I couldn't run anything. I can barely run my own household. But it's not his skill set, and I think that's clear. Why in the world would Howard hire him to set up another institute like that when it's so clear what happened at BU? And I can't imagine what the idea is that, what he and the Howard people are saying, that it didn't work out at BU because of something else, but rather clear from even unbiased media accounts. And of course, you and I know more, that it was him. That's not what he does, including that he doesn't do scholarly work, as in he doesn't write refereed academic articles. How would he supervise people creating ones of their own? That's all. So it's a curious choice. And I don't know, it looks to me like with having Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Kendi, Howard is trying to assemble a lineup of superstars. But maybe I'm just behind the times. Maybe I'm stuffy. I don't know. But Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones are journalists. And okay, you can hire a journalist. But Ibram Kendi is called a historian, but he's not an academic historian. Never has been. It's not what he does. It's just these stars. And all power to them, but I'm not sure I quite understand that a university does that, as opposed to hiring Jelani Cobb, as opposed to hiring Roland Fryer, actual people who do or did actual scholarship. I just don't understand it, and I must admit it's a little disappointing.
Well, I'll make a number of points. According to Kendi, the model will be different.
Mm-hmm.
I saw an interview for the Washington Post about this move. The model at BU had a lot of staff that were employees, permanent employees that had to be supported. And you had to get the grant money year to year to make sure you could pay their salaries and keep them busy doing whatever they were doing. The model at Howard is going to be like postdocs or 1 year visiting fellowships that will rotate, and a person will come with a project that'll be vetted by a committee before they're selected, and they'll have their dissertation that they're converting into a book, or they'll have their research that they want to complete and write up and submit as an article. They'll work on that project. They'll be funded by Kendi Center, and then that'll be gone. And then the next year you'll have a different crop of postdocs or fellows who will be doing the same thing. He says he wants to concentrate on the African diaspora, and that he's especially interested in technology, AI, and climate issues, people's migratory patterns driven in part by climate change dynamics, and the introduction of very sophisticated large language model type AI systems could build in racial biases in one way or another, and he wants to try to identify that. So that seems to be his program. I don't know that it's the administrative aspect may be different, but I don't know that the intellectual content is particularly different from what he was doing at Boston University. The question of Howard, and you say, why don't they get Roland Fryer or somebody like that? Well, they can't. He's not going there. He's playing in a completely different league. I think of an acquaintance of mine, a friend. I think I can call him Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the historian. He was at Harvard. He was unhappy there. He moved to Princeton. His alternative options were Princeton or Columbia or Cornell or Stanford or something like that. He's a real player in the academic big leagues. So he has outside options, and Howard would be, I mean no disrespect to this at all, but from a certain point of view, it'd be a step down. It'd be playing in a different league from an academic point. And again, I really don't mean any disrespect. I'm just talking about the way people make their career decisions.
Yeah, maybe, and maybe that's what I'm misunderstanding. I'm expecting Howard to do something that it would not be in a position to do, in which case maybe it makes sense that instead you have celebrity journalists who can teach students a thing or two, or even somebody who's formally an academic but doesn't do academic work and is really a celebrity public thinking person of a sort. And okay, all right. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything, but it's just, actually, it doesn't make me angry. It really just has left me kind of perplexed. Although I must say, I must feel sorry for somebody who all that they're seriously interested in is racist discrimination, how we're being discriminated against. And so you look at the most pressing issues in our world now, such as AI, climate change. And what you see is, how is that bad for us? Where's the racism in it? It's just, do you have anything else? And that's the Montessori kid in me. And I'm probably asking too much. It might even be a frivolous criticism. But what about us overall? What about an institute that's not just if it's about the diaspora. Diaspora is a nice word. I can say this now. I've seen that one. You say the African diaspora because you can fit anything under it. And I was in the African American Studies department at UC Berkeley now 400 years ago. I was there when they first got their doctoral program. Everybody was very excited about studying the diaspora. And really, that just meant studying anything. But if it's about the diaspora, is the only thing that happened in the diaspora that we got our asses kicked? Like, what else? But whatever. All power to him.
Not to raise a contentious point, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, The Message, about which you and I have vociferously disagreed in the past, and we need not rehash those disagreements because that's not going to be my point. My point here is he goes to Senegal and he reflects self-consciously on the diaspora, on Black people coming home. Is this really home? What would that mean? On how people perceive him who are embedded within the indigenous Senegalese, in this case, setting, on myth, on ideas about history that are overly simplified and one-dimensional, but that serve a certain kind of purpose. I think I should say, really good friends with Orlando Patterson, the sociologist. He's Jamaican, and he's been around for 60, 70 years writing, 65 years writing. He writes novels, he writes big treatises, he writes smart essays, he does a range of different stuff. And the African diaspora spread throughout the New World, in the United Kingdom and other European venues and whatnot, that is something of great interest to him. And it's complex. It's really a rich vein of historical and humanistic and political and identitarian and whatnot. It's a very interesting thing. And I'm sure, you know this because we've encountered some Black people in Europe. And I remember that conference we went to in the United Kingdom, for example, the Equianos Project sponsor, who are very thoughtful, critically so, about exactly how the Black experience viewed in global perspective should be read. And I think would agree with it's not all negative, it's not all victimization, it's not all struggle against oppression and point of view. And, I'd like to think that a place like Howard University, which would bid to be a serious intellectual center, would see that. So there would be counterpoint. Nicole Hannah-Jones is a successful journalist. She mounted the 1619 Project at the New York Times Magazine. That's a piece of accomplished professional journalistic work. Whatever one might think about the project, you have to say that if you're a student of journalism and you get the benefit of her wisdom about, how do you manage that portfolio, that, you're being pretty well served. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a good writer. Again, whatever you might think about it, the brother can write. Writing seminar with him at the head of the classroom is going to be a scintillating experience for those students. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
Ibram X. Kendi, I wish I could say something similar about him. Nothing comes to mind at the moment except his books. How to Be an Anti-Racist was a runaway bestseller in the year of George Floyd. But, let me cut the brother some slack. God's not finished with him yet, as they say. Maybe he's going to surprise me coming down the pipe. I would say this, though. Serious engagement outside of the Race Studies Center with other disciplines and other ideas that are bouncing off you. You got a history department with real historians. You got a philosophy department with real philosophers. You have an English department with real literary critics in it. These things should not be siloed. In a university, they should be integrated into the larger intellectual life of the institution, in my mind, in order to do the best work.
I guess we'll just have to see. He certainly hops around a lot, but maybe he'll stay at Howard and do what he does. You're right. You need that interdisciplinary focus, and you can't help wondering whether that's actually going to happen. There's an anecdote about him. This is a little grubby, but I'm going to do it. He's on a show with, well, it's not an anecdote, it's true. He's on a show with 3 other writerly people, and the person asked them what they think.
I'm sorry, who are you speaking of, John? I didn't hear you.
Kendi.
Okay, he's on a show with 3 other, okay. Mm-hmm.
And he's being asked by the host of this show what he thinks of Ulysses, the book. And the other 3 say what they think, and he just says, I haven't read it. And that's it. Now, I haven't either. I have read some Joyce. I've read a chunk of Joyce. I have always dreaded Ulysses from what I read about it, but I could have faked it. I could have said, well, and I would have said, I haven't read it, and I would have mentioned something else by Joyce, or I would have, talked about what scares me about reading about it, et cetera. But with him, it was just, And I get it. For him, that's just something somebody white wrote. That's not important. He wants to study his anti-racism. But I worry that person, and it wasn't, I'm sorry I haven't read it, or whoops, I haven't read it. It was just, I worry
almost as if he were proud to have not read it.
Almost. And I just wonder whether there's going to be the interdisciplinary aspect, because you miss that basic sense of curiosity. But I don't know him. Maybe I'm missing something about him. I don't know what books are on his nightstand. So, he might surprise us.
Yeah. I was intrigued, John, I should say, by your last, I think it was your last column in the Times where you talked about passing.
Mm-hmm.
What was her name?
Belle da Costa Greene is J.P. Morgan's librarian. Yeah. And she
Tell us a little bit about that. I'm interested in that.
She was a woman whose mother was very, very light, and her mother had been married to a light but detectably black and successful man. They divorced in the late 19th century, and they had been in Washington, D.C. And so the mother takes Belle and her siblings to New York. They change their name somewhat, and they pass as white. And Belle da Costa, a name they made up because their idea was that to the extent that they've got some tint, they're part Portuguese. Really, it's just Belle Greener. Belle da Costa Greene is somebody who's deeply interested in art, especially European art, but then she extends that to Asian. Of course, African art is not really on the horizon yet for someone like her, but she's passionately interested, and she manages to make her way into being J.P. Morgan's librarian at the big, beautiful Morgan Library. And she lived in the early 20th century as a white person. And she never married, but she had a long-term involvement with a white scholarly, a white artistically erudite man. And, I think her life ends in 1948, maybe 1950. And as it happens, I just went to the museum exhibition about her at the Morgan Library yesterday. And it's funny because when you see the pictures of her, and this exhibition, I think, has every picture of her, it's clear she's not white. Like, passing is one thing, and there's a photo of her mother where you can tell this is one of those black people who passed because she looked precisely white. But Belle, let's call her a shade lighter than me. You can see it in all the pictures. It's clear that she's not white, but apparently a great many people in her life kind of let a fiction pass, which shows that, times back then were more complex than we might think. And that's Belle da Costa Greene. And she would not let these racial categories define her, which in her time meant not saying I'm biracial or I'm just a person, but she made it as if she was a swarthy European white person. So that was Belle Greene. And there ought to be maybe not a musical, but a chamber opera about her, the way she lived her life. I would like to see it done as a stage version. A good friend of mine, James Blue, is putting together a documentary about her. I'm imagining it's going to be American Experience or something like that. Fascinating figure. and not attended to enough until recently. And also in the piece I wrote about, there's a collection of her letters coming up where you just get to read this white Black person who's fascinated by everything in 1909, 1913. And what you see, to tie it back to what we were just talking about, is her curiosity. She gets a set in French of 1001 Nights and 1001 Arabian Nights. She cancels her theater plans because she just wants to sit on the floor and read through these volumes. She's got that kind of curiosity. And she's interested in the world, and she just wouldn't be hemmed in. And, she was lucky. She was light enough to be able to pull it off. But that was what I wrote about. And, one other thing. Hilton Als in the New Yorker went to the exhibit and writes about her as essentially a race traitor. And he says he basically says she couldn't live a coherent life. She left the warmth of her real people behind and ended up living as this neither one thing nor the other person. And that's not true. That's not what you get from the exhibit. That's not what you get from her letters. She was a thoroughly happy person. If she had some understandings and some questions about, whether she had left her real self behind, that was not the main thing on her mind at all. She was interested in art and going to the theater and gossiping. She seems to have been a very happy person. And I think that's what we mean by complexity. When we look at her, we can't think, oh, it's Piola, it's Freddie Washington, an imitation of life. That must be the life she lived. No, not all people who passed were miserable in that way. Some of them just passed. Probably most of them, the ones that nobody wrote a novel about. And that's what Belle Greene is.
What interested me in reading your piece was you suggesting that the historical experience of race was complicated in ways that might actually be liberatory, that might be breaking from the constraints. You start by talking about Karen and Robert Field's book, Racecraft, and the critique of race as such, as a category of social imagination, of literary, of scientific, the figment of the pigment, the thinking that the pigment is real. That's a mistake, according to this kind of argument.
I think I got that from you. Yeah.
Yeah, the figment of the pigment, which was actually I got from Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom in their book, America in Black and White. And I was critical of it at the time, perhaps overly so. And I juxtaposed, the figment of the pigment. What about the enigma of the stigma?
Yes, that's right.
We're going to play a rhyming game. Let's play a rhyming game. But I had a point. And the point, I think, comes up in the context of Belle, the personality, the librarian that you're referring to, which is she's able to pass notwithstanding her swarthy complexion because she persuades people that she's of Portuguese descent, which is to say she persuades them that she's not a descendant of American slaves. That was the thing that was most important, not being a descendant of American slaves, not being, rather than having a Northern European complexion and hair color and whatnot. It was that, although swarthy, she's not a descendant of slaves, therefore escaping the enigma of the stigma that attaches to slavery. And you could celebrate the heroism and independence of a life not constrained by the figment of the pigment, while at the same time recognizing that liberatory move does nothing to subvert the enigma of the stigma. It doesn't relieve the society of the legacy of slavery that is etched into its very imagination, that is intrinsic to its very operation. It merely says that a person operating on the margins in terms of their morphology can move around and there's some room for maneuver. I'm glad there's some room for maneuver, but that doesn't exactly address the large-scale political, historical phenomenon.
No, not at all. And I just found that thinking about her and then thinking about the erstwhile head of the NAACP, Walter White, who physically basically was white, but used that to pass in the South in order to investigate lynchings. but up north, considered himself a black person despite looking the way he did. Nevertheless, his second marriage is to a Jewish woman. It's very interesting identity.
Walter
But
White was married to a Jewish woman?
he was married to a black woman first, and then they divorced late in his life. And the love of his life had been this white Jewish woman, and they got married, and they were happily married. And so, but he considered himself a black man. And it's just, in both of those cases, he had neither one. He considered himself black, not just anything, and Belle Greene considered herself white, not just anything. So it's not as if they were living what Barbara and Karen Fields suggest, but they get me thinking that they show the possibilities of that. They show how arbitrary our sense of these things is. Now they did what they did because Belle didn't want to live as a black person. Walter White did it because he was raised among black people and didn't want to leave black people behind. These days, if we're going to get past race the way Barbara and Karen Fields think we should, stop thinking of it as a legitimate category in any way, I found myself thinking about those two because they did. It's hard for us to imagine really getting past it, but not them. And they weren't thinking about there being no race, but it was kind of a beginning. And both of them have always struck me as very queer in that way. You look like this and you're calling yourself that. But we need more of that if we're going to really stop perceiving race at all and get past the enigma of the stigma. Yeah, very interesting figures. Walter White, there's going to be a documentary about him on PBS in a few weeks where you could actually see him walking and talking.
That's later this month, right?
February 25th, it premieres. I got sent a screener, which is what actually got me thinking about him at that same time. I was thinking about Belle Greene because of the exhibition and the New Yorker article. So I threw it all together into one piece. That was one of my longer ones for the Times, actually, but I wanted to really spin out some ideas. I hope I succeeded, but that was what that piece was about. And I read Racecraft.
Well, congratulations on that. I have yet to read Ulysses.
I know we were supposed to do it together, but I couldn't resist. So.
No, it's all good. It's all good. And
because it had become my Ulysses. Like I felt ignorant not having read it. And I wanted to stop having to just kind of nod or to say I hadn't gotten to it yet. So I just wanted to get through it.
Now, the one thing you didn't talk about, you can't talk about everything, is skin color prejudice amongst Black people. The colorism phenomenon, the prizing of the good hair and the light skin and all of that among people, all of whom agree we're Black, but some of us are better looking and more desirable as sexual partners and neighbors and friends. I don't know if that how that's into your scheme.
In my experience, I feel like that's gone. I grew up in Philadelphia, not Mississippi. And so maybe it would have been different. I'm told by a friend of mine who did grow up in Mississippi, Black, that it has been different in his experience. But I haven't seen it. I haven't felt it. And I'm not that light. I'm the middle, red, as they call it. I always think of that as something from another time, paper bag test and all of that. But maybe I just don't travel in the right circles. I can definitely say, quite honestly, that I don't feel it. I did not internalize that growing up in Philadelphia in the 70s. But, I know there are people who are on the edge of their seats telling me, oh, you just don't know this. And maybe they're right, especially if they're from the South. But yeah, I think of it as something from another time. You're light-skinned and so you're better. Or you're prettier.
I
feel like that was going out in the 70s.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm older than you, and coming up in the 50s and 60s, I think I was still in a world in which that was important. But I would have to acknowledge that as I look around and consider my own experiences and whatnot, it's not as salient a feature of African-American life in the year 2025 as it was in the year 1965, the year you were born.
Yes.
Oh, John, you've got a 60th birthday coming.
No, not soon. October.
Okay. You got a
8
retreat.
months to not be 60. So, yeah.
Well, okay. We'll have to acknowledge that when it comes around, though, won't we?
That's going to be a big one. Yep.
All right, this has been Glenn Loury and John McWhorter. We're the Black Guys. We do a podcast every other week at the Glenn Show. We've done it this week, talking about the end of race, which we view with a certain degree of trepidation, I think, but also a certain degree of anticipation. If I may speak for you, John.
You have spoken for me, definitely.
Okay, folks, see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Glenn. See you, folks.